afternoon, everybody. My name is Julie Welch, and I am a graduate student here at Nazareth College studying voice performance and pedagogy. This is my second year working at the Hickey Center as a graduate assistant. Our mission at the Hickey Center and the International Institute of Islamic Thought Chair for Interfaith Studies is to promote understanding and appreciation of differences through education and dialogue. This year, our focus is on how interfaith dialogue can inform and challenge the consciousness of members of the Nazareth community and the greater Rochester, New York area to stand up for racial justice in peaceful ways. We are happy to welcome Dr. Charles Kimball to Nazareth College this afternoon to speak with us about the growing problem of Islamophobia in the West, identifying major factors that contribute to this dangerous dynamic and developing meaningful ways people of faith and goodwill can and must work together to shape a more healthy and hopeful future for our interdependent and pluralistic communities, nations, and world. We ask that you submit your questions to our panelists through the chat box and keep your microphones on mute, as our students will be moderating the question and answer section of the discussion today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Julie. And my name is Reverend Nadia Mullen, and I work in the Center for Spirituality. I also serve as the Interfaith Program Specialist. At the Center for Spirituality, it's home to a wide variety of student, religious, and spiritual groups, and that includes our Hillel Jewish Student Organization, the Muslim Student Association, our Catholic student group, Nazareth Christian Fellowship, Zen Meditation, and a discussion and community group for students who identify as atheist, agnostic, or otherwise as an alternative spiritual humanist. These groups join together for dialogue and interfaith cooperation through the Interfaith Leadership Cohort, which meets twice a month on Wednesday evenings. I am so happy to welcome the Nazareth student community to our workshop this afternoon with Dr. Charles Kimball. Dr. Kimball was the presidential professor and chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, Oklahoma. Between 1996 and 2008, he served as chair of the Department of Religion and professor of comparative religion in the Department of Religion and the Divinity School at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. An ordained Baptist minister, he received his PhD from Harvard University in comparative religion with specialization in Islamic studies. So please help me welcome Dr. Charles Kimball.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Good, okay. I will plan to speak for 15 or 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have plenty of time then for questions and discussion together. Thank you for the invitation. I obviously very much appreciate the work of the Hickey Center. This is right up the alley where I've spent a great deal of my life working. I got interested initially in the study of world religions and interfaith issues as a child. My father's father was Jewish. It's a long and colorful story that I won't take time to explore right now, but he and one of his brothers ended up becoming a famous song and dance comedy team in vaudeville 100 years ago. And during those days, he met my grandmother, who was a 19-year-old chorus girl in the vaudeville show, who happened to be Presbyterian. So they married, which was very unusual 100 years ago. That kind of a mixed marriage is very common now, but it wasn't then. They ended up settling in Oklahoma, where my grandmother was from eventually. And so I grew up with a Jewish grandfather who was the most wonderful person I knew. And I discovered that about the time I hit the third grade, not everybody else had such a positive view of Judaism around me. I didn't know what anti-Semitism was, but I got a dose of what prejudice and bias, bigotry looks like at an early age, as I heard people saying things about Jews that I knew just were not true. They never even met anybody Jewish. They were simply repeating things they'd heard from somewhere else. So early on, I began to sort of wrestle with questions of what today we would call particularity and pluralism. What does it mean to be a person of faith with commitment, with depth, with integrity, but also with an awareness that surely my experience of God is not doesn't exhaust all the possibilities. Had I been born into another part of my own family, I would be Jewish. If I were born in Cairo, there's a 90% chance I'd be a Muslim. And how do you make sense of that? Where's God and all that and so forth? So that really led me to study world religions, and through a series of events that I'll be happy to talk about in Q&A if you're interested in pursuing that, I became deeply involved in contemporary issues of Christian-Muslim engagement, religion and politics in the Middle East especially, and in the US. During the Iran hostage crisis, I was directly involved in that, and then spent the decade of the 80s coordinating mission and service work for 42 denominations in the United States with the Christian community and the interfaith communities throughout the Middle East, in the middle of war zones and refugee camps and all the rest. So I've spent a great deal of my life working not only as an academic, but at a practical level, engaging issues on the ground. I'm increasingly convinced that the 21st century may well be defined by interfaith issues. Obviously, we've had a brutal year, and we're nowhere near out of the COVID pandemic crisis. And that has dominated, that along with politics in the United States, has dominated a great deal of our energy and attention. But I think it's very clear that interfaith issues, and particularly Christian-Muslim relations issues, are going to resurface with some real challenges. As we've seen the growth of Islamophobia manifest in a variety of ways. Even the hints and clues we get, there are many stories now surfacing more visibly about attacks on Asian Americans in different parts of the country because of the connection that some political leaders make with China and the pandemic. We've seen flashes here and there pretty visibly of continuing anti-Semitic behavior. Remember the marchers in Charlottesville a little over a year ago were chanting, or 2 years ago now, Jews will not replace us. Well, those weren't Muslims, those weren't Hindus who were marching with those kind of chants. And so it's just below the surface, if that. And once I think the attention shifts a little bit away from the pandemic, hopefully, the kind of extremist groups, some Christian, certainly Christian nationalists, many of them have Islam in their sights as a big problem. And so we're going to see issues related to interfaith understanding, cooperation rise again as very central. There's a long history here. I won't recount it, but I would like to just make a comment or two about what I think makes Christian-Muslim relations particularly distinct. When you think about it, Islam as we know it arose in the 7th century, although Muslims have always maintained this was not the beginning of Islam, but the continuation of the same religion God had revealed through many prophets and messengers, Muhammad being the final prophet, not the first prophet. And so Islam was not a new religion, but the one true religion that God had revealed multiple times through different prophets and messengers. This religious tradition and soon civilizational system came onto the scene and was a remarkable success. Within 100 years, Muslims had moved out from Arabia and had conquered the lands of North Africa and Spain all the way up to the Pyrenees Mountains, and the other direction all the way over to India, Pakistan. Today, the world had never seen anything like this, not even the Roman Empire, the Greek conquest of Alexander the Great and his successors. And so it was a stunning development in the world, and a remarkable civilization ensued from all of that. This was the only thing, when you think about it, the only religious-based movement and civilizational system that ever really threatened Christendom. Once Christianity grew beyond its humble Jewish beginnings, there was never really any other religious system that posed a serious threat. Judaism, the Jews were being persecuted by and large by Christians. There was never a danger of Scandinavian mythology making a big comeback, or Native American or African traditional religions quite the other way around. They were usually overwhelmed by the Christian tradition in various ways, and not always very positive ways. But here comes a religious tradition that says that it talks about the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, the one true God, the God of Abraham and Moses and Noah and David and Jesus and John the Baptist, angels and devils, judgment day, heaven and hell, the Virgin Mary, the virgin birth of Jesus. Sounds pretty much like our religion. And of course, that's what the Muslims were saying to Christians and Jews. It is the same religion. It's just that you got a few things wrong, and those are major sticking points. Obviously, the divinity of Jesus and the notion of the Trinity are clearly rejected by the Quran and Islam. But for the large majority of Christians who were unlettered, they couldn't read or write, they didn't have Bibles, it sounded for many of them like it was pretty much the same religion, except this was being successful. And so one of the things that's fascinating to study, and I do this a little bit in an overview in the book in one chapter, is this spread of Islam, and how, if you look at the history of the relationship of Christians and Muslims with the Christian communities that have lived together under Islam, dominated by Muslim societies, and particularly the Middle Eastern area, compared with the Christians in Western Europe, who primarily saw Islam as a threat coming at them, very different histories and dynamics. One of the things that's promoted by a lot of people, certainly in recent years, with the rise of extremist groups claiming inspiration from Islam, is that somehow Muslims are commanded to go kill the Christians and the Jews. This is obviously not the case. It's not obvious to a lot of people who promote that view, but the fact that there are 14 to 16 million indigenous Arabic-speaking Christians in the Middle East today itself speaks to the point. I hope you can't hear my dog in the background. My wife's retrieving her. She's saw a dog walk by the front door apparently, so she just got her. I was going to go get her, but I don't have to now. She's been muzzled, as it were. In any case, the very fact that there were this many Christians living together in Muslim majority countries makes it clear that Muslims never thought it was their job to kill the Christians, quite the contrary. You do have throughout history a lot of periods of tension and conflict, and we've certainly seen a fair bit of that with groups like ISIS persecuting Syrian Orthodox Christians and Yazidis. We've had attacks on churches in Egypt. There are certainly extremist elements that are going after anything that differs from them, and especially Muslims. More Muslims have suffered under the extremism of violent extremists claiming inspiration from Islam than have others. So there are real issues there. It's not to be dismissed, but the vast majority of Muslims have never understood relationships should be defined in that way. You look at that history, and the reason I mentioned that, and I won't elaborate further, we can go further in Q&A if you wish, is to say that really woven deeply into the fabric of Western civilization, it permeates Western literature, is this very deep sort of bias and fear of Islam. It's in Dante's Inferno. See where Muhammad and Ali are very deep in the, in the pits of hell in Dante's Inferno, just a few rungs above Judas. Read Martin Luther. Martin Luther wrote several books where he attacks Islam. On one called On Diatribes Against the Turks, he declares the Quran is a vile and shameful book. He acknowledges he's never seen a copy, but he just knows that it's vile and shameful. Well, these are great, very influential thinkers in the West. There are some exceptions, and I talk about this some in the book too. Most notably, St. Francis of Assisi was a very notable and wonderful exception to the rule. And there were others too. One of the heartening things, I think, on the current scene is that the current Pope took the name of Francis very deliberately and is picking up on the most positive aspects of Vatican II and John Paul II's work in interfaith cooperation and engagement, and in the spirit of St. Francis, which is a real high point, I think, and something to build on. In any case, I just want to underscore that for a lot of people who are not ill-intentioned, there's a lot more bias and fear of Islam kind of woven into the fabric. I would say in the same way that a lot of people, and certainly in the United States, but not just in the United States, have been more imbued with racist ideas and images and fears than they perceive, gets woven into the fabric in a way that you have to do some serious unlearning and looking hard at your biases and perspectives, that there's this bias towards Islam that doesn't exist when it comes to Hindus or Buddhists. There's a lot of bias towards Jews as well that's woven in pretty deeply. But that's changed quite a bit in the last 60 or 70 years, not as much with Christian-Muslim relations. So there's a great deal that has to be done in terms of education and even unlearning and opening people's eyes to the kind of bias and bigotry that a lot of people just take for granted, that this is something to be feared. Islam is to be feared. It's coming after us and going to overwhelm us. And so that resonates with a lot of people in a way that we have to take, I think, seriously. In the years since 9/11, having been a student of Islam and interfaith work for now almost 4 decades, in the years since 9/11, there's a great deal that we can point to that's very positive and very hopeful. A lot of dialogue initiatives and programs that really began and have developed in earnest. I know in Oklahoma, I did 75, 80 programs with the leading imam in the state in Oklahoma City. Wonderful man, Imad Chazi is his name. Grew up in a Palestinian refugee camp in southern Lebanon, and just an amazing, amazing man. And he and I have done programs all over the place together. And so I could point to many things, the number of courses that have been developed and taught now in universities. When I first began teaching full-time 30 years ago, every year I'd get 6 or 7 universities coming after me, trying to hire me away from Wake Forest because they needed someone to teach Islam. There weren't very many people who could do that. Now there are a lot of people who have advanced degrees and who are teaching Islamic studies throughout the country. A lot of programs in churches. I know a lot of Muslim leaders who have been run ragged for the last 20 years, racing around to respond to the requests from different churches and interfaith organizations and groups like yours to have a chance to meet with and engage and answer questions from people in local settings. Those are really important, and there's a lot that's positive that's happened. At the same time, we've seen the rise in Islamophobia. And this has certainly been exacerbated, I would say, and I do say in the book, by our previous president, who did a lot to fan the flames of Islamophobia in multiple ways. I cite in the first chapter, when I kind of set up the challenge, a number of very prominent religious leaders and political leaders in the United States who really have fanned the flames of Islamophobia very overtly, very directly. And so I let them speak for themselves and say, here's what they're saying, here's what they're doing. And it's no wonder that a lot of people, and there are a lot of clergy too, people who aren't as visible as some of the prominent leaders, people who have TV ministries and things, but there's a lot that's been clearly happening in local church settings. I run into this all the time as I see heads nodding as well. People is like, well, where do you get these ideas? Well, my minister said, or my preacher said such and such. And so there's a lot that's happening, a lot of misinformation and fear being stirred up and developed. One of the things I also do, I'll say more about this. I hope some of you can join for the longer presentation tonight. But one of the things, in fact, Dr. Shafiq and I were just talking about a little bit, is the penultimate chapter in the book deals with questions of dialogue and mission. Christianity and Islam are two of the great world religions that are missionary in orientation, the third being Buddhism. Woven into the fabric of these traditions is the imperative that people take that message out, share the good news with others. And so this is not something to be put aside, but this is part of what it means to be, I think, a faithful Muslim or a faithful Christian, to bear witness to the good news as you've understood it and experienced it. And for a lot of people, this becomes the blocking point that, that it leads to a kind of exclusivist theology, which has been a dominant one, certainly on the Christian side historically. And so I try to unpack that and demonstrate, particularly through the work of the Vatican and other institutions, especially in great thinkers in the last 50 or 60 years, that these are not exclusive. These are not either or, but can be both and. It is possible to bear witness to the truth as you understand it, but with also maintaining an openness and a receptivity and an appreciation for the fact that we're all human beings and that none of us have all the truth locked down. We don't have God in our pocket. In fact, that's when it becomes very dangerous, when people start thinking they do know exactly what God wants for them and everybody else. History shows us in another book that I wrote that's sadly still selling well 20 years later, when religion becomes evil, you've got the seedbed for very destructive behavior. People can rationalize almost anything when it's not what I want to do, but what God wants me to do. And we see this manifest in various ways historically in all traditions, but Christians and Muslims probably at the head of the list in terms of abusing others when in positions of power. There's one other chapter I just want to briefly mention just to draw attention to it, because I think it's part of the larger educational effort that those of us who are hopefully people of goodwill will pursue. And that is, I have a chapter entitled The World We Actually Live In. I like that title a lot, to sort of break through and say, okay, you know, there's all these buzzwords out there, Sunni and Shia and Sufi to some extent, jihad, Sharia, you know, what do these terms actually mean? How do they work? And so for a lot of people, I'll give one example just to illustrate why it's important to unpack this. In 2010, in my home state of Oklahoma, and we were there, been there for a couple of years, gone back, Oklahoma, somebody at the last minute put forward a vote for the November elections, where there was basically a vote on banning Sharia law from Oklahoma. It was so poorly written, it was banning Sharia and all other international laws from Oklahoma. So apparently we couldn't do business with Sweden anymore because that would be international law. It was quickly thrown out of court, but this initiative passed with a 70% plurality. 70% of the people voted to ban Sharia law. And over the next decade, I've engaged in an informal, not scientific, study where I talked to over 100 different clergy in Oklahoma. And at some point I would pose to them the trick question, what do you think about this Sharia deal anyway? And almost universally, it was a highly negative response. Oh, well, I'm against it. You know, we don't want it here. So, well, okay, but what specifically, what is it you're concerned about? What is about Sharia that is troubling to you? And the response was almost always, well, you know, Sharia, we don't want it. Okay, but what about Sharia? Give me some detail. Sharia, we're opposed to Sharia. In other words, they had no idea what it was, how it worked, how this is always something that's in process, that there are various schools of thought and legal traditions and judgments. And so this is always growing and changing and evolving in different ways. It's not as rigid and fixed, and not a whole lot of it has to do with criminal law, but that's the sort of images that people had coming out of the Taliban or out of extremist behavior of some groups connected to Saudi Arabia, et cetera. So the fear was there, but the information about what it even means or what jihad is for Muslims was palpable. So there's a great deal. So I try in that chapter to sort of say, what about the world we live in? Not this world of fear and fantasy, but let's explore what these terms mean and unpack them and see that they're not really very threatening at all, but are quite consistent with things that other people of faith in major traditions affirm and seek out as well to the best of their ability. The last part, and I'll just mention briefly, but then move to our Q&A time here. And that is the last chapter where I really talk about how do we move forward. And education is certainly at the forefront. I have a section titled Education, Education, Education. Can't be stressed enough with courses, with dialogue programs, the kinds of things that you all are doing through the Hickey Center are, I think, increasingly important at all levels. And so I don't need to repeat that since that's what you are about, but also engagement, personal engagement. One of the things that's been very successful, certainly in Oklahoma, where I've been for most of the last 12 years until last summer, and that is interfaith iftars, where Muslims have hosted groups to come and share in the breaking of a meal, breaking the fast during the month of Ramadan, We began doing this in universities, Oklahoma University, Oklahoma State. I'm a graduate of Oklahoma State, undergraduate. And the president at Oklahoma State, wonderful man, good friend, invited me and the imam to be the speakers a decade ago when he started this process of an interfaith iftar. Over 300 people showed up for the first one. He was surprised. He was particularly surprised, even though he's a very open and receptive person, to discover there were 42 Muslims on the full-time faculty at Oklahoma State University. He didn't realize there were that many permanent members of the faculty, not to mention the person who ran the student union and so forth. So there are all kinds of people who came out of the woodwork in a way that came for this interfaith iftar. And so that tradition continued. It's dropped off a little bit in the recent months or recent years because Ramadan has fallen in the summer the last several years. Even though we still had events, they weren't quite as robust since a lot of people weren't around during the summer in the same way. At the University of Oklahoma, the Muslim Students Association organized an event they call Think Fast, which was a great event. And what they did was they encouraged students and faculty, staff, anybody who wanted to participate, to fast for a day, to basically follow the rules of the fast. Don't take any food or drink or do pleasurable things in the daylight hours. And then save whatever money you save, contribute that to a charity of your choice, not an Islamic institution or anything, just whatever charity you want to donate to, and then come and we'll feed you a wonderful meal in the evening. We'd have 500 or 600 people come, speakers, and learn more about Ramadan and what it means and how it works. But more than anything else, it helped serve to put a human face on the Muslim students who were part of the university community and faculty and others. And just so people who knew, well, that guy lives down the hall in the dorm, or that professor, I knew he was from the Middle East somewhere, but didn't know he was a Muslim, etc. It really helped to open up dialogue, conversation, engagement, and also to, again, demystify and even elevate the beauty of what the fast of Ramadan is about. So those kinds of events are very, very important as educational opportunities, but also personal engagement. Anything that we can do, and I'll finish with this, there are many more things to talk about, but I don't want the time to get away. Anything we can do where people of faith and goodwill work together, whether it's working together in a food pantry, many places all over the country, different communities, congregations have come together to build Habitat for Humanity houses, for example. Well, you don't have to agree with, on Jesus in order to work together to build a Habitat for Humanity house. But in the process, at least in my experience and my own perception, as you engage other people, you live into your theology. You learn more, you broaden more, you humanize the other in a way that makes it much more difficult for people to continue to push the kind of stereotypical images and monolithic thinking that I think drives a lot of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism historically. So let me stop with that. And so we have plenty of time for people to raise questions or challenge things I've said, whatever you'd like to do. I'd be happy to hear from you. I think the kind of thing I was just talking about at iftar, that tends to work really well. What I've done, and I've spoken at a number of these, and we've had a number of cities have done this too in Oklahoma. And Oklahoma is a very, very red state, in case you hadn't noticed. I think it's the only state, I'm embarrassed to say, that in 2 presidential elections, not a single county went for Barack Obama. I think it had the distinction of being the only state that fell in that category. It was very, very conservative. And yet we had mayors in Oklahoma City and Norman and Moore, which is a suburb of Oklahoma City, hosting interfaith iftars. And so part of what you discover and have speakers. I mean, when I speak, what I do is I not only talk about, what is supposed to be accomplished, what the fast is intended to do within the Islamic context, but also connecting that to the fact that this is something that's very common in all the different world religions. The notion of physical self-denial as a means to spiritual insight and even spiritual growth or spiritual power in some cases. It's obviously central for Hindus and Buddhists traditionally. Jews fast on Yom Kippur, and Christians. I grew up as a Protestant, where fasting was not taken seriously. As I used to joke, Baptists prefer Wednesday night suppers to fasting, so didn't take group deeply. But certainly in the history of the Catholic tradition and in Orthodox traditions, fasting's been a very important component. And it was actually when I lived in Cairo in 1977, 78, Ramadan fell in August. It was 108 degrees and very long days, a lot of sunshine in Cairo in August of 1977. And the brutality, the difficulty of that really hit home. I'd studied it, but to actually see what was required, it wasn't required of me as a non-Muslim, but to see what was required made me, appreciate and think about that more deeply. And then I'm reading one day in the Gospel of Mark in the New Testament, and I read a story that I'd read 20 times before and never hit me before, where Jesus sends the disciples out to heal people and cast out demons. And they come back and report there's one particularly nasty demon they can't cast out. And basically Jesus' response is, yes, some of them are very difficult. They can only be cast out through prayer and fasting. And boom, it hit me right between the eyes, like, wow. In the New Testament, there is Jesus reportedly connecting fasting to a spiritual power of casting out a demon. I'd read that many, many times. It never hit me before. But then as a student of world religions, I began to look at that and realize, well, it's right there in the Christian traditions. The Catholics and the Orthodox got it all along. We Protestants kind of punted that for some reason, but it's right there. And so I like to use those kind of events to help people see that this is not unusual, but it's a way of connecting. It's a way of recognizing everything we have comes from God. It's a way of equalizing people, whether you're wealthy or poor. You feel hunger and thirst when you're fasting, and it reinforces the notion that we're all equal before God, that we all depend upon God, that whatever we have, the blessings we enjoy, we should be much more aware of those who don't enjoy those blessings and what are we doing with our resources. So there are a lot of things like that when you begin to unpack it, that Islam then for non-Muslims isn't so mysterious and dangerous, but quite beautiful. And people can see that and experience that as they're engaging people in their own community who are practicing the fast. So I think things that put a human face on the other are especially powerful for educational purposes. I alluded to that a little bit at the beginning. I think the incredible success as the Muslims moved out and conquered, and that's of course what people have done historically up until recent, just the last century or so, and even then, still happening now. If you look at attacks on Ukraine or other places that are being taken over. But historically, those who had power and influence moved out and conquered lands. And when the Muslims moved out in a military way, they were incredibly successful. Muhammad died in the year 632, the Common Era. By 636, the Muslims had already conquered Jerusalem. Were moving into North Africa. And as I say, within 100 years, they'd moved across North Africa up into Spain. They returned back in a battle in the Pyrenees, near the Pyrenees Mountains in 732, 100 years later, but moved across Mesopotamia. I mean, this was all the way over to India, Pakistan in 100 years. So the success struck fear, I think, particularly in the hearts of European Christians. One of the reasons that Luther was so negative and hostile certainly was that the Ottomans were knocking at the door. They were in Austria, what is Austria today, at that time. And so this fear of Islam as a conquering force, and also a real threat theologically to Christianity, I think is where it's rooted. And as I say, when you really, and I spent a lot of my early professional life working with Christians in the Middle East who have lived together with Muslims for 1400 years. And one finds very different attitudes among many of the Christians who've actually lived together with Muslims and cooperated together with Muslims as minority communities in their case, than those who see Islam only as something that's coming at them and fearful or to be afraid of. And so I think it's rooted in some historical reality. And that's why I began with that, I think one has to take that seriously. But it then gets woven so deeply into the fabric. Uh, a little book that you might want to have a look at sometime, it's now 50, 60 years old, by Professor R.W. Southern, called Western Views of Islam in the Middle Ages. It's a series of lectures, famous lectures that were put into book form. And here he recounts, and then let me just as a side note, there are several books by a very serious scholar named Norman Daniel, Daniel is his last name, that deal with the history of Christian perceptions, understanding of Islam, several tomes that he wrote that really give a much more detailed history. But in Southern's little book, he reiterates many of the images that were so prominent throughout Europe for centuries. It was widely believed, this is quite vile, but widely believed in Europe for centuries that Muhammad died, he was killed by swine while urinating. Where'd that come from? Well, just anything you can think of that was vile and offensive, somebody made it up somewhere, and it travels around Europe as truth. It was widely believed that he used to had a white dove trained to sit on his shoulder, and he would put seeds in his ear so that the dove would pick out the seeds to make it look like the Holy Spirit was speaking to him. Again, this just made up out of whole cloth, has nothing to do with anything. But those kinds of things permeate Europe. This is a false religion. It's a dangerous religion. It's not surprising that Dante has them down in the pits of hell, depicted in a very vile way, where there's Muhammad and Ali are both depicted as split down the middle with their entrails spilling out because they are the great dividers of men, as he put it, schismatics, that this false heretical teaching. So this runs very deep, and it's, as I say, much more, I mean, it really, I think racism is a good way to think about it, that a lot of people who don't perceive themselves to be racist or sexist, for that matter, have had a lot of unlearning to do because they've just been raised in a context where certain things were given, certain ways of speaking, and even thinking about gender and the use of pronouns and so forth, without realizing what you're communicating in the process. I think it runs in that same sort of family of ideas that is much more kind of woven into the fabric than people realize. I have been, I think, fairly successful at this for a variety of reasons, I think. But one of the things I've been told multiple times over decades, enough times that I actually think I'm believing it now, that I have a fairly non-threatening way to raise difficult issues. And dealing with the Middle East over the years, I found I was able to do that, to speak to different audiences without being charged with being anti-Semitic because I was critical of Israel or whatever. I think there are ways to do that in a non-threatening way, but in a way that's direct. And so I would say, for example, when I'm speaking to a Christian audience, what I'll often do in a church or in a church kind of setting is, begin with something like, let's talk about 3 biblical mandates that we Christians should all be aware of when we start engaging in questions related to interfaith issues. One, the 10 commandments, one of the commandments is not to bear false witness against your neighbor. How can you help but do that if you don't know who your neighbor is, if you don't know what your neighbor believes, if what you believe about your neighbor is wrong? You're bound to be bearing false witness. So it's incumbent upon you to at least understand your neighbor. Then, one of the most famous passages in the New Testament where Jesus is asked, what's the greatest commandment? And his response is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. In the Luke version of that story, the person persists, the young lawyer says, yes, but who is my neighbor? And so Jesus then gives the response of the parable of the Good Samaritan. That's your neighbor. It's the other. It's not the one who thinks like you and looks like you, but it's the one that is, that you're not supposed to like. And so to love God and love your neighbor is at the very heart of the Christian, to be a follower of Jesus. This is what he put the emphasis on as being the most important commandment. And then finally, I point to the book of Romans, where Paul says, insofar as it is possible with you, live at peace with everyone. So those are very powerful biblical mandates, from the Ten Commandments to Jesus to Paul. And so how do we do that? How do we seek to understand? So the first thing, and one of the ways I find it's very effective as well, is to turn things around and to help people see it from another perspective. So for example, I'll often say, okay, let's just assume for a moment that we are now in Bangladesh or we're in Pakistan, okay? And you're all Muslims and I'm a Muslim, but I've studied Christianity a lot, and I'm now here to teach you something about Christianity. Hold that image, come back to where we are right here now, sitting in this church. What is it you would hope that that Muslim who's teaching about Christianity would say to those other Muslims about Christianity? You would hope that they wouldn't simply, point to someone flushing a toilet or flushing a Quran down the toilet at Guantanamo, or take pictures of Abu Ghraib, or show pictures of someone blowing something up during the, from the British Catholic Protestant conflicts, or some of the horrific things that we know we can point to that Christians have done historically, from crusades, inquisitions, whatever, or even some violent extremists today. We know those are all part of the picture, but Christians understand that that has nothing to do with Mother Teresa, with the food pantry the Presbyterians are running, with what my church is doing, et cetera, et cetera. So what would you hope that that person, you'd hope that they would present some kind of picture of Christianity that most Christians would say, yeah, that generally is what, we affirm. We understand there are extremes. We know there are people doing things that are, most of us think are horrific and offensive, and they think they're being good Christians. Most of us would disagree with that, but I can't erase them out of the picture. They're part of the larger community as well. But we'd hope that they'd paint a picture of Christianity that we could recognize and was fair-minded. That's the way we want to try and approach Islam. Let's try to understand it as most Muslims understand it, as they live it out. And then when you begin to, just ask people to be fair-minded, and some of that means taking a step back and being willing to unlearn some things that you think you know. In the case of Oklahoma, then it becomes very helpful to start pointing out things like Muslims make up 1% of the population in Oklahoma, and probably 12 or 13% of the medical professionals. Over 450 medical doctors practicing in Tulsa today, same in Oklahoma City. The largest home builders in the state of Oklahoma are two very close friends of mine, Iranian brothers who stayed and who started with nothing and built an incredible, and they're just incredibly generous, wonderful people who support all kinds of things. Well, people know about home creations. Oh, those are Muslims? Yeah, those are Muslims who are building homes all over the place and who are contributing to all kinds. So when you begin to, sort of expose, the top cardiologists in Oklahoma City and the top oncologists, one of the most incredible eye doctors who performed glaucoma and cataract surgery on my wife, is a 45-year-old Jordanian American who invented a new technique that he travels around the world teaching other people. He's an amazing physician, a very devout, very pious Muslim. He's not trying to take over anything. He's trying to fix people's vision. Cardiologists are not trying to blow up something. They're trying to fix your heart and help you. And so when you begin to kind of break through, that makes a big difference. One other just example, and I'll probably say a few of these things tonight in more detail. I tend to speak up and engage people even in public settings. When I hear something, sometimes my spouse will run for cover because she thinks I'm going to get decked for injecting myself into somebody else's business. But someone's spouting off in a public setting and making some, and this happens more than I'd like to admit. I inject myself and say, excuse me, but I happen to know quite a bit about Islam, and what you're saying is just not true. Well, what do you mean? And then so we'll talk a little bit. Usually it gets quite a reaction that someone challenges them. And then I'll ask them, well, do you know any Muslims? And the typical response would be, thinking, well, I don't know, I guess that guy Muhammad, who is the pharmacist at CVS, I think he's a Muslim. I said, well, if his name's Muhammad, there's a pretty good chance he is. Yeah. Well, he's a really nice guy. So, wow, that's amazing. What are the odds? 1.7, 1.8 billion people, and you found the nice one. What are the odds of that happening? And of course, for some of the people, it goes right over their head. They miss the point. Other people began to realize, if you actually know a human being, they don't fit your stereotype. Islam is not monolithic any more than Christianity is. And so I think there are ways to gently but firmly challenge people and not let them just get away with racist and bigoted statements. And often if you just think about, if you heard something that was that blatantly racist about African Americans, for example, how would you respond to that? What would you say to someone, especially if you're not African American? But it's like, well, I'm not going to let that pass. What you're saying is really deeply offensive, and it doesn't help anything other than spread hate and fear and bigotry. And so I don't appreciate you saying that in a public setting. Um, Part of the challenge, I think, for most of us is that we grew up with our mothers telling us not to talk about religion and politics in public. And I'm saying I think we better be doing both pretty intentionally these days, because there's a lot on the line. And silence can be easily interpreted as acquiescence. Yeah, I think that's a great question. One of the things the MSA did at the University of Oklahoma every year, was to have an Islam Awareness Week, where they would have speakers come, and sometimes faculty members, sometimes the imam or other Muslim leaders, like these home builders, whatever, would come and just speak, and on different things, theological issues, or some of the practical challenges that they face, with their kids in public schools that recognize Christian holidays and a schedule that doesn't quite fit, with their expectations as Muslims and so forth. How do you deal with some of the food issues, et cetera? And so I think there are things like that one could do in terms of an Islam Awareness Week, where you'd set a week aside and have a program every day that you'd have a different topic and speaker, and you could explore things like Islamic understandings of Jesus, or the role of revelation in Islamic understanding, et cetera, revelation and reason. You could have any number of topics that might be not terribly threatening, or there are great resources. I don't know if you all are probably aware of the Pluralism Project that Diana Eck and Harvard University has been doing for now 30 years. Diana is a very close friend. She and I were in graduate school together, lived apartments side by side. Very dear friend. A great project, great resources. So there are things there that can be used even as a kind of educational jumping off point. One of the good things is that a lot has already been done. And so there are resources available like that online that you can pick up on, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel always. But I think some kind of educational, programs where you could plan, discuss, here are 15 possible topics. Let's pick 5 that we think would be most interesting and engaging, and draw people into a conversation, just so we're developing more awareness and knowledge and so forth. That can be done virtually. Yeah, well, I think this is, it's a challenge for people in all communities. What I was just saying about, how I speak up in a public setting, I'll take on, somebody who's speaking out. But I realize that a lot of people, that would be very difficult for them to do. One, they wouldn't feel like they would know what to say if someone came back at them with, what about this? Or, don't Muslims believe X, Y? And, I feel like I have the knowledge and experience that I can say, well, yeah, there are some Muslims who, would argue this, that, and the other. But, most people in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere are just trying to figure out how to make Egypt work. I'm not trying to take over the world. So I understand that there's that factor, and certainly because of the bias against Islam that runs pretty deep, there's a fear of sort of walking into that or being so visibly identified. And I can't give a pat answer to that, but I think it is important. And this is one of the things that my friend Imam Inchazi has written about and talked about, the importance of Muslims. And this is one of the good things I think that's come out of 9/11, is that more and more Muslims have realized we have got to speak up because we're being represented by extremists. And unless we, step up and say, that doesn't represent me. And so he and others have organized, for example, prior to COVID, they would go about once a month to a very busy street corner in Oklahoma City near a major intersection and stand there with a sign saying, ISIS does not represent me. Very visibly, Muslim men and women dressed in a way that was clear they were Muslims. And so they were making a kind of public witness. They also organized every year a Muslim Awareness Day at the state capitol with the legislature, where they would have a lot of people going, to meet with legislators and just talk about who we are, our community, what are the kinds of issues and challenges we face. But we also want our students, our young people to, learn more about how government works. And so they can be good citizens. So what do we need to know so we can participate, effectively and creatively as American citizens? And so it was that kind of strengthening healthy ties. And I would say, again, this comes back to one of the earlier questions. One of the things that I think is helpful to a lot of people who initially have, a lot of fear and hostility towards Islam is to, just remind people that, look, we celebrate the fact in this country that we believe in freedom of religion, that we believe in freedom from government imposed religion, that people should be free to practice their faith as they see fit, as long as they're not harming other people in the process. And I think it's especially incumbent upon people like me, who are in the majority religiously and also as a white male, to be at the forefront, protecting the rights of people who understand the world, have a different worldview, a different way of thinking and worshiping, or even saying no to all this. I mean, people who think religion is a silly, anachronistic way to look at the world, they also have a place at the table in this country, and that there's no religious requirement for citizenship, and we should be protecting the right of people to say and think what they think, as long as they're not being harmful to other people. And so if you just reinforce that, then I think you begin to see some people recognizing, oh, well, gee, that effort to block the mosque from being built, that's really pretty un-American, isn't it? I said, yeah, it really is. Would you be blocking a Baptist church or a Disciples church if they were trying to build, down the block? And so I think there are ways to sort of begin to open people to the things that we claim and say we're on pretty solid ground. And my last little sermon here will be, and I have this in another book that I wrote 7-8 years ago now, that increasingly I think it's important for all of our foibles and flaws and problems and history in this country. We actually, when you look around the world, we have a kind of foundation for a positive approach to pluralism and diversity that the rest of the world desperately needs to see work and work well. And so the challenge for us is to actually live up to our own ideals, to manifest that to the world. We are in an increasingly interdependent, interconnected, and far too quarrelsome world community. And we are in this together increasingly. And so we need to be working hard to manifest to the world that it is possible for people of different faiths and no faith to live together with respect, with tolerance and respect, and see pluralism as a rich component of our community rather than something that's divisive.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Kimball, and thank you to the students for some wonderful questions. As Hawa mentioned, there will be a Muslim Appreciation and Awareness Week that will be coming up, hosted by our MSA later in the semester. So more information will be coming. And our MSA does offer a number of events throughout the course of each week, as well as Dr. Shafiq leading a Quran study each week as well. So you can check out the NAS app for more information about those opportunities to engage every week here on our NAS campus. And also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Dr. Kimball will be with us tonight at 7 p.m. Via Zoom. So please, I hope that you'll all make the effort to tune in at 7 o'clock tonight for more opportunity for learning and engagement around these really, really important issues. So thank you so much, Dr. Kimball. This was a
You're
wonderful
welcome.
hour.
Thank you.